In this last video for Module 17, we consider hydrothermal landscapes. Now I should mention that hydrothermal landscapes are not really related in any way to limestone topography that we looked at in the last video. Here's a geyser field, and we're going to be talking about the distribution of hydrothermal areas in the U.S. So these are areas where the magma is not too distant from the crust. So let's go ahead and take a more focused look at geyser fields. And this is sort of a cutaway view of a geyser field I created so you can see some of the hydrothermal features we're going to be talking about. So let's talk about sort of what contributes to the formation of these features. So we'll start with looking at sort of the bottom of this diagram. We've got hot rock down here. This hot rock is heated by magma down below. So pretty deep down there's molten rock which heats this hot rock that's above it. And in turn, this hot rock heats porous rock, a rock that has a fairly large amount of water in it. So in some cases, that heated water will rise up through cracks and joints into other layers of porous rock. And sometimes it'll rise all the way up to the surface and form what we call a hot spring. So if there's a pretty consistent amount of water coming up all the time, it becomes a hot spring at the surface. And many times that water will seep back down into the system and it sort of recycles over time. Occasionally, the water doesn't make it all the way to the surface, but makes it part way into some sort of an underground chamber until the pressure builds, and then very suddenly the water and steam come up on their own accord all at once. And we call that sort of a phenomenon a geyser. So it comes all the way to the surface. Now geysers erupt at various intervals. We know Old Faithful erupts at a very consistent interval of around 45 minutes. Every 45 minutes, but some geysers don't erupt very often, maybe once a day, once a week, once a month, once every few months. So geysers are pretty unpredictable in terms of eruption, but they form again because water makes it up part way into a chamber and then reaches this critical mass of pressure. A fumarole is where you just have steam emerging from the surface. So here I'm showing a fumarole here sort of in the center of this geyser field. And then a mud pot is where you have water that comes up to the surface and mixes with other types of things like silty and clay materials at the surface and forms a sort of oozing, bubbling cauldron. Here's a geyser field. Sort of a typical view. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference between a hot spring and a geyser. So a lot of geysers actually look like hot springs. So we'll look at a few examples of that. Just to show you where the major geyser fields of the world are, we're going to be looking at geysers in several of these geyser fields in the next few slides. But just to give you an idea of where most of the photos were taken that I'm going to show, most of them are from Yellowstone here or El Tatillo down in Chile here. A few are from Iceland and some of these other geyser fields. So we'll look at sort of a cross-section of different geyser fields. And let's take a quick tour. This is the Tatallo geyser field in Chile. It's pretty high up. It's the highest geyser field in the world at over 13,000 feet. And you can see there's no boardwalks. You can sort of go around, walk around wherever you want. The hot springs sometimes look like geysers. It's hard to really know whether you're looking at a hot spring or a geyser. This is in fact a hot spring that you're looking at here. Again, no boardwalks. And here in this part of Chile, central Chile, incredibly dry. This is near the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on the planet. Incredibly dry, very little vegetation. The Norris Geyser Basin is one of the best known geyser fields in the country, and if you haven't been here, you've got to go. Put it on your bucket list. It's pretty accessible to Americans. It's in Yellowstone National Park. This is not where Old Faithful is found. This is a separate geyser basin from the one that's right in the portion of Yellowstone National Park that has Old Faithful. So there are other geyser fields near Old Faithful, but definitely if you go to Yellowstone, you've got to get to the Norris Geyser Basin. It's really amazing. Another view of the boardwalk. They have boardwalks here that you're supposed to stay on. It's the law that you're supposed to stay on these geyser boardwalks. And this is a giant hot spring here you're looking at with all these different colors. I should mention the different colors are driven by the minerals in the water. So the water is evaporating all the time and it's leaving behind these minerals. So the blues and the purple colors and the lighter blue colors are minerals. The green and yellow colors and these mats that you're looking at here in the foreground are typically algae that's at a temperature where it can sustain itself, still at a pretty high temperature. Just to show you a quick view of the Norris Geyser Basin. I've got one of the geysers highlighted here, the Pork Chop Geyser I'm going to talk about just in a second, but you can see just the massive number of geysers in this geyser field. And so the Porcupine, we'll take a look at this Porcupine Geyser. I want to tell a little story about something that happened there. And we'll come back and look at that in just a little while. But just a quick finishing up our tour of geyser fields. This is Kamchatka's Valley of Geysers on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia in Russia. Not as visited as some of the other geyser fields of the world. This is a geyser field in Iceland. And then to show you one in New Zealand, so you get sort of a complete sample. Again, those orange colors may be minerals, and in some cases they may be algae mats. Okay, a little bit about hydrothermal features. Again, a hot spring, as I mentioned, it's where you have very, very hot water coming up sort of on its own accord, coming up from pretty far down in terms of depth. The temperatures in hot springs can be pretty high. I'll show you some examples of temperatures in just a minute. Here we have the blue color in temperature. These are the hottest temperatures. This is the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park. You can see just for scale the size of the people on this walkway right here. It's massive just in terms of its size. It's huge. The blue colors representing temperatures of 165 degrees. The yellow are slightly cooler, 160 degrees, and then orange, and then the red-brown, which would represent where the algae mats are forming at around 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty hot, and you couldn't survive if you fell into one of these things. You wouldn't last very long. These are really, really hot. This is a view of sort of ground level view of the Grand Prismatic Spring. So really an impressive sight. They have some unusual features near the geysers. This is Lemonade Creek in the Norris Geyser Basin. Here, as a caption mentions, microbes appreciate the acidic water with temperatures between 104 and 131 degrees Fahrenheit. You could probably stick your finger or hand in this and you wouldn't be injured, but it's not advisable because you'd have to walk off the walkway. And that's exactly what happened on June 7th, 2016. As I say on the slide, a 23-year-old man from Portland, Oregon slipped and tragically fell to his death in a hot spring near Pork Chop Geyser. And he wanted for the trail. He and his sister illegally left the boardwalk and walked more than 200 yards in the Norris Geyser Basin when the accident happened. And he was usually accidents like this happen where someone's taking a photo, selfie. And this is the really horrible part. The next day, workers couldn't find any remains in the boiling acidic water. There was nothing left of the young man. Just a pretty terrible story. Some other geysers, I've created a slow motion view of this geyser so you can see what's called geyser in Iceland erupting. So again, this one kind of looks like a hot spring, but look at how quickly, and you watch how it accelerates here in terms of the eruption. Pretty amazing eruption. So geyser in Iceland. And let me mention some types of geysers and types of eruptions. You might think that all geysers have similar types of eruptions, but they don't. There are actually two types of eruptions that we find in some of these geyser fields. The fountain geysers erupt from a wide opening or vent. So they look a lot like hot springs. Water collects in the vent before and during eruptions, often mistaken for a hot spring. And I'll show you some examples of fountain geysers so you can sort of see the difference between fountain geysers and the other type of geyser I want to mention. That's the cone geyser, and this is the one that has a narrow opening or vent, and they operate under pressure, and they look like the nozzle of a fire hose when they go off. So Old Faithful would fall in this category of cone geyser. So here's how you can see the difference between the two. The fountain geyser in the view above, right next to this stream. So that's a fountain geyser with a pretty wide opening. And then the cone geyser in the lower view here erupting. And just so you see some examples of cone geysers, at least the place where they erupt. This one on the left is a photo I took at the Tateo geyser field. And there's Fly Geyser in Nevada, has a whole number of openings. So more than one sort of nozzle opening with the Fly Geyser. So what kind of geyser is this? What do you think? Fountain or cone? If you said fountain, you're correct. So this is a little geyser in Iceland. And how about this one? Definitely a cone geyser, even though it's got a pretty wide opening. This is Castle Geyser, very similar to the geyser Old Faithful, Yellowstone National Park. And then this is the eruption of Old Faithful at Yellowstone National Park, and it's so reliable that they have a clock on the wall that you can go and know within a few minutes of when it's going to erupt. And so people start to sort of fill the benches from the viewing place, so they can watch this geyser erupt, and it's really spectacular. I mean, you don't want to miss Old Faithful if you go to Yellowstone. So how deep are geysers? How deep down in the ground do they go? Well, they're not super deep, but just to show you a comparison of how deep that sort of vent area is, that not vent area, but I guess that collection area, if you will, is underground. The place where water collects. With Old Faithful Cone Geyser, it's pretty deep. It goes down about 20 meters or even more. And the movement of water is up. It's sort of a side movement that sort of fuels this other geyser in the Kamchatka region of Russia. It's a fountain geyser, and then geyser that we looked at in that slow motion video. Fountain geyser has pretty deep. It goes down pretty deep, very similar to Old Faithful. Some products that come out of geysers, some things that are formed from geysers, include geyser eggs. They're sort of unusual things. There are also things that people put in geysers that shouldn't be put in geysers, and the National Park Service has a collection of garbage that for whatever reason people thought it would be appropriate to put into a geyser and see what happens. It's very illegal if it's federal land, so don't do it. But these are some of the things that were fished out of geysers over time by the National Park Service. Just to continue our journey through looking at different kinds of hydrothermal features, mud pots, again, a mixture of the hot water coming up. There may not be a huge amount of hot water, but it mixes with sediments, silt and clay at the surface, and it forms something like this, these sort of bubbling cauldrons, if you will. Here's a mud pot in Iceland that's sort of, looks like a witch's cauldron or something. That's sort of the way I think of it. But another example of a hydrothermal feature. And then fumaroles are just where you have steam coming out of the ground. This is Bumpus Hill at Lassen National Park in California, Northern California. But a fumarole there, it's just with steam coming out of the ground. So not a lot of liquid water, but just steam. And another one here. This one's a fumarole near the Kilauea volcanic eruption in Hawaii. And one more on the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. This surrounded by snow and ice. Another unusual feature that, I sort of put on this list because I've always been sort of fascinated by travertine. Travertine is found in the northern part of Yellowstone National Park at the one of the entrances, and it's a place where this hot water, instead of sort of rising up vertically, for a while it travels horizontally through layers of rock, through cracks and joints, and then it comes out as little terraces. So I think of it like sort of a terrace situation with little terraces filled with hot water. Very unusual, the travertine. And finally, I thought I'd mention there are some hydrothermal features in oceans. We tend to think of hydrothermal features as only being associated with terrestrial areas, and there are definitely hydrothermal features in ocean areas as well. We just don't see them. They're at the bottom of the ocean. These undersea vents that are venting hot water all the time, so we just want to be aware that they're there. There are many of them all over the ocean bottom. And here's the location of some of these undersea vents, so you can sort of get an appreciation for how many there are. And finally, I thought I'd mention hydrothermal landscapes created by people. So it's possible for people to create sort of a contrived hydrothermal environment. Maybe you've been to some of the hot spring areas in New Mexico. They have some really great ones. There's a couple in particular that I like to go to that are near Taos, New Mexico. Natural hydrothermal landscapes where you can go lie in this hot water. Here's Hot Springs National Park. It was actually the first protected area in the U.S. in 1832, but Hot Springs National Park has these naturally hot springs. They're springs rather than something like a geyser field, but still impressive to see and visit. This is my favorite place, Ojo Caliente. Don't tell anyone I told you. Near Taos, New Mexico. We love to go there. Friends of mine and I, when we go skiing, pretty neat place. And then Iceland's Blue Lagoon is entirely contrived. So you look at this landscape, and this is created by people, entirely created by people. But it's massive. It's just a huge area, a recreation area that's completely heated by hot water, by this hot thermal water. And in fact, if you travel on Reykjavik, the streets of Reykjavik, this sort of shows you where they're doing a little bit of street construction, but they don't get snow piling up on the streets of Reykjavik because they take advantage of this hot water, and they use it to keep the streets clear of snow and ice. And then I thought I'd mention, this is one more view of central Chile, not far from the Tateo geyser field that I showed you a little bit earlier, but this is thermal mining. It wasn't very successful in central Chile because what they were doing is generating electricity, but the electricity that what they produced was so far away from where anybody lived, it really wasn't, it didn't make a lot of sense economically, so they gave up on the project.